What happens when a symbol of freedom becomes a trigger for control? You think selling a yacht is just a transaction, a moment of closure, a step forward. But what if that act, so personal and private, becomes a spark that exposes the rot beneath your neighborhood's pristine surface? What if the very people tasked with protecting your peace are the ones orchestrating your downfall? This isn't just about a boat. It's about illusion, power, and the terrifying ease with which truth is buried. Welcome to the story of a yacht, a 911 call, an HOA unraveling, and trust me, you won't believe how it ends. I sold my yacht on a Tuesday morning, and I remember the light, how it fractured across the water like a promise I was finally ready to keep. It wasn't just a vessel. It was a metaphor, a floating rebellion against everything that had tried to box me in. For years, that yacht had been my escape, my sanctuary, my silent protest against the HOA's suffocating rules and the suburban choreography of compliance. But selling it wasn't surrender, it was evolution. I thought I was stepping into a new chapter, shedding the skin of a man who needed symbols to feel free. I didn't know I was about to become a symbol myself, of defiance, of disruption, of everything the HOA feared but couldn't name. The transaction was clean, legal, and quiet. But quiet doesn't mean invisible. And in neighborhoods like mine, visibility is currency and threat. The moment the buyer's truck pulled into my driveway, I felt the shift. Curtains twitched. Phones lit up. The illusion of neighborly indifference cracked. I had broken an unspoken rule. I had acted without permission. Not legal permission, social permission. The kind that enforced not by law, but by glances, whispers, and the ever-watchful eye of Karen. Karen wasn't her real name, but she embodied the archetype so perfectly it felt dishonest to call her anything else. She was the HOA's unofficial enforcer, the self-appointed guardian of order, the woman who believed that control was synonymous with safety. And to her, my yacht was chaos. Not because it blocked a driveway or violated a code, but because it represented autonomy. Autonomy terrifies people who build their identity around rules. It's a mirror they can't look into without seeing their own fragility. So when I sold the yacht, Karen didn't see a man moving on. She saw a man stepping out of line. And when people step out of line in places like this, the response isn't conversation. It's escalation. She called 911, not the HOA, not the city, the police, over a boat sale, over a moment of personal transition, over the idea that someone could act without her approval. The call itself was absurd. A vague report of suspicious activity, a truck, a transfer, a man who didn't look like he belonged. But absurdity is often the mask of deeper dysfunction. And dysfunction, when institutionalized, becomes danger. The officers arrive with polite confusion, their presence both surreal and symbolic. I explained. They nodded. They left. But the damage was done. The signal had been sent. I was now marked, not as a criminal, but as a disruption. And in HOA culture, disruption is the ultimate sin. What followed wasn't immediate. It was slow, creeping, bureaucratic. Letters, inspections, complaints, all wrapped in the language of concern. But concern is just control in a cardigan. And I began to realize the yacht wasn't the problem. I was, or rather what I represented. Freedom, non-compliance, the refusal to be small. And in a system built on illusion, that refusal is unforgivable. It wasn't the sound of sirens that disturbed me. It was the silence that followed. The kind of silence that settles in after something irreversible has happened. When the air itself feels complicit. Karen's 911 call wasn't just a reaction. It was a declaration. A declaration that in this neighborhood, autonomy is suspicious. And suspicion is enough to summon force. I remember watching the officers step out of their cruiser, their movements slow, rehearsed, almost bored. They weren't responding to a crime. They were responding to a narrative crafted by a woman who had mastered the art of weaponizing concern. Suspicious activity, she had said. A large vehicle. A man I don't recognize. Something about a boat. That was enough. Enough to trigger a response. Enough to turn my driveway into a stage. And as I stood there, explaining the sale, the paperwork, the buyer's credentials, I realized something chilling. I wasn't being questioned. I was being profiled. Not by the police. They were just actors in a play they didn't write. I was being profiled by a system that had normalized surveillance as a form of belonging. In HOA culture, watching is caring. Reporting is responsible. And control is safety. But what happens when that culture turns pathological? When the line between vigilance and violence disappears? Karen's call wasn't about the yacht. It was about power. The power to define what belongs, who belongs, and when. It was about reclaiming control over a narrative she felt slipping away. Because when I sold the yacht, I didn't just move on, I disrupted the choreography. I reminded people that freedom is possible. And in a system built on conformity, that reminder is dangerous. The officers left. No arrests, no citations, just a report, a record, a mark, and that mark became the seed of a campaign, a slow, deliberate campaign to reassert control. It started with letters, notices, concerns. Then came the inspections, the citations, the meetings, all wrapped in the language of order. But order, when enforced without consent, becomes violence. Not physical violence, psychological violence. The kind that erodes your sense of safety, your sense of self. I began to feel watched, not just observed, monitored. Every movement, every visitor, every package. It was as if my home had become a set, and I was the antagonist. The man who dared to act without permission. The man who sold a yacht and, in doing so, exposed the fragility of the system. Because systems like this aren't built to withstand autonomy. They're built to suppress it. And when suppression fails, retaliation begins. Karen didn't need evidence. She had fear. And fear, when institutionalized, becomes policy. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was a case, a file, a problem to be solved. And the HOA, once a benign bureaucracy, became a machine designed to grind down dissent, to reassert control, to remind me and everyone watching that freedom has a price. And in this neighborhood, that price is isolation. They say power is loud, but in neighborhoods like mine, it whispers. It doesn't shout orders or bang gavels. It sends emails. It posts notices. It smiles while it suffocates. The HOA isn't a government, but it behaves like one, a shadow bureaucracy wrapped in the language of community. And like all bureaucracies, its true power lies not in what it says, but in what it implies. We're just here to help. We're maintaining standards. We're protecting property values. These phrases are the lullabies of control. They soothe while they surveil. They pacify while they punish. And most people don't question them, because questioning requires discomfort. It requires admitting that the system you trusted might be broken, or worse, that it was never built to serve you. After the 911 call, I started noticing things, subtle things, a new inspection schedule, a sudden uptick in violations. My mailbox became a portal to passive aggression. Your lawn is 1.5 inches too high. Your trash bins were visible for 12 minutes past collection. Your porch light is too bright. These weren't rules. They were reminders. Reminders that I was being watched, that I had stepped out of line, that the system was recalibrating to contain me. And the most disturbing part? It was all legal. The HOA's bylaws, those dense, unreadable documents, gave them the authority to inspect, to fine, to escalate. And because I had signed when I moved in, I had consented. Or so they claimed. But what is consent when it's buried in 40 pages of legalese? What is consent when the alternative is homelessness? The illusion of choice is the most dangerous illusion of all, and the HOA thrives on it. It presents itself as democratic. A board, elected officials, meetings. But democracy without transparency is theater. And this theater was well rehearsed. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was a board member. She had access, influence. She knew how to bend the rules without breaking them. And she knew how to make dissent look like disorder. I tried to fight back. I attended meetings. I asked questions. I cited statutes. But every answer was a deflection. Every concern was noted. Every challenge was met with a smile. and a reminder of procedure. Procedure, the sacred text of bureaucratic control. It doesn't need to be fair. It just needs to be followed. And when you question it, you become the problem, not the system. You, the man who sold a yacht, the man who disrupted the choreography, the man who refused to be small. I began to understand that the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. It was enforcing identity. A collective identity built on sameness, predictability, and silence. And I had become noise. Not because I was loud, but because I was different. And in systems like this, difference is dangerous. It threatens illusion. The illusion that everything is fine. That everyone agrees. That control is kindness. But illusions, when stretched too far, begin to tear. And as the pressure mounted, as the citations piled up, as the meetings grew colder, I realized something profound. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. It was protecting itself. From change, from challenge, from truth. And truth, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. It started with a whisper, not from a neighbor, but from a clerk. A misplaced document. A citation that didn't match the code. A fine issued without a vote. At first, it felt like a glitch. Bureaucracies glitch all the time. But this wasn't a glitch. It was a fracture, a hairline crack in the polished surface of HOA authority. And once you see a crack, you start looking for more. I began to dig. Not out of vengeance, out of necessity. Because when a system turns against you, understanding it becomes survival. I requested records, meeting minutes, financial statements. And what I found wasn't illegal, but it was revealing. Patterns, loopholes, decisions made in private, then rubber-stamped in public, fines issued disproportionately, inspections targeting specific homes, and always the same names involved. Karen, her allies, the board. It was a closed loop, a feedback system of control, masquerading as governance. And the deeper I looked, the more the illusion unraveled. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. It was protecting itself. From scrutiny, from accountability, from change. I found evidence of selective enforcement, rules applied to some, ignored for others. I found financial irregularities, funds allocated without clear purpose, invoices paid to companies with board connections. I found silence, neighbors who tried to speak up, then disappeared from meetings, from committees, from relevance. And I realized this wasn't just about me. It was systemic, a culture of control, sustained by fear and apathy. Because apathy is the lifeblood of corruption. When people stop asking questions, power calcifies. And calcified power doesn't bend, it breaks. I compiled everything. Documents, emails, testimonies. I didn't go to the HOA. I went above them, to the city, to the state, to the agencies tasked with oversight. And suddenly, the silence broke. Investigators arrived. Quietly, discreetly, but their presence was seismic. The board panicked. Meetings were canceled. Emails went unanswered. Karen stopped walking her dog past my house. And the neighborhood, once so compliant, began to murmur. People asked questions, compared notes, realized they weren't alone. Because isolation is the first tactic of control. Make the dissenter feel alone, and you make them powerless. But exposure breaks isolation. It creates connection. And connection is resistance. The investigation grew. Subpoenas, interviews, audits. And with each step, the illusion cracked further. The HOA's authority wasn't divine, it was constructed. And like all constructions, it could be dismantled. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking truth. Because truth, once buried, becomes toxic. It seeps into the soil, the walls, the relationships. And the only antidote is light. Harsh, unforgiving light. The kind that reveals everything. Even the things we'd rather not see. I watched as the board fractured. Resignations, deflections, denials. But the documents didn't lie. The patterns didn't lie. The neighbors didn't lie. And slowly, the neighborhood began to awaken. Not with rage, with clarity. Because rage burns fast. But clarity endures. And in that clarity, we saw the truth. The HOA wasn't guardian. It was a gatekeeper. And the gates it built weren't to keep danger out. They were to keep autonomy in, and once exposed, those gates began to rust. It was never about the yacht. Not really. The vessel itself, fiberglass, chrome, teak, was incidental. What it carried wasn't cargo, but meaning. And meaning, when misunderstood, becomes threat. To Karen, to the HOA, to the system that had calcified around the illusion of control. The yacht was a rupture, a floating contradiction, a reminder that freedom doesn't ask for permission. But to me, it was something else entirely. It was a mirror that reflected who I had been, who I was becoming, and who I refused to be again. Selling it wasn't just a transaction. It was a transformation, a shedding, a declaration. And that declaration echoed louder than I ever intended, because in places built on silence, even a whisper can sound like a scream. The yacht represented movement, not physical movement, existential movement, the kind that says, I am not what you expect, the kind that disrupts the choreography of conformity. And that disruption, once unleashed, cannot be contained. It spreads, it infects, it awakens. The neighborhood, once lulled into passive compliance, began to stir, not because they wanted yachts, but because they wanted choice. They wanted voice. They wanted the right to define themselves without fear of fines, or whispers, or weaponized concern. And in that awakening, the yacht became myth. Not legend, myth. A symbol not of luxury, but of liberty. A reminder that autonomy is not a privilege granted by boards or bylaws. It is a birthright. And birthrights, when reclaimed, are revolutionary. I watched as neighbors repainted their homes in colors once deemed too bold. I saw gardens bloom with plants once labeled non-compliant. I heard laughter where once there had been only quiet nods and closed blinds. The HOA, stripped of its illusion, became what was always meant to be, a facilitator, not a gatekeeper. And Karen, the woman who had called 911 over a boat, became a cautionary tale, not a villain, not a scapegoat, a mirror, a reminder of what happens when fear is allowed to masquerade as order. But the story doesn't end with her, or with me, or with the yacht. It ends and begins with a question. What are we willing to sacrifice for the illusion of safety? And what might we gain if we choose truth instead? Because truth is messy, it's uncomfortable, it's disruptive, but it's also liberating. And in that liberation, we find something deeper than compliance. We find connection. We find community. We find ourselves. The yacht is gone. The driveway is empty. But the space it left behind is sacred. It is the space where illusion died. And truth, raw, unsettling, beautiful truth, was born.